It's good afternoon where I am, 1 o'clock Central. I'm in the Kansas City area. I'm representing the Truman Library today. I'm Mark Adams, the Education Director at the Truman Library, and I'm going to be presenting to you this afternoon a presentation about Truman's life through objects. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. And I hope that we can get some interaction so we can use the chat box for that. And let me get my slideshow going here and we'll be able to begin. So that's the title of the presentation, Truman's Life Through Objects. And what I'm going to do this afternoon is kind of step through really a chronology of Truman's life, but looking at it through a different lens than you might usually, through objects, photographs, documents, three-dimensional artifacts from mostly or all actually from our museum and archives collection at the Truman Library. We are one of the 14 presidential libraries under the National Archives and Records Administration. So it's your tax dollars at work because we are a federal agency. And I'm going to go right in here and start the presentation. Glad to have you on board this afternoon. And we will be using the chat box for some interaction as we go. So be ready for that as I pose some questions or ask for thoughts on things as we go through this. So this is just a quick overview of the first half of the presentation. We're going to be looking at a variety of objects in the early part of Truman's life before he becomes president in 1945. And you can see the timeline there. And then we will look at the second half of the presentation, the timeline a little bit later on. To look at some objects from his presidency. But we're going way back in time here. If you noticed on that timeline, this is around 1889. And this is where we'll get you involved. Taking a look at this first object, in this case, a photograph. Just type in there the first thing that you see on there. What do you notice? We're going to use a couple of different strategies this afternoon. One of them is called visual thinking strategies. And the other, we're going to be doing some object analysis. With this image, what do you notice in this photograph? What's the first thing you notice? And then we'll start to dig in there. So just type in anything that you notice in this photograph, and then we'll start to look at some details. So Nicole says they are all school kids. Very good. Old and rusty says Maddox. School kids says Ryan. Anything about the way they're dressed or anything else you can see in this images? Dressed in covered clothes. Says Letitia and children, right? Anything else? And it's interesting, my daughter who's in 5th grade has got her school picture day tomorrow. So it seems to be that time of year. Large class, there's an adult in the background. Well done, Letitia. And it is a large class. There's a lot of people there. Black and white photograph. Thank you, Nicole. Anything that might be seen a little differently than maybe a school photo you might see taken now? There's some handwriting on the lower part of the image, correct? Very good. The different clothes. Yeah, the clothes probably look different than we might see today. No one is seated. Yeah, they're all standing up, it looks like. To me, it looks like they may be on maybe some steps in front of the building because of the way they're all tiered up, although it's hard to see the steps maybe on the left side. They took it outside instead of inside. The doors resemble barn doors. That's an excellent observation. So this is really interesting. In one photograph, you can start to pull all of these details together. Now, as of course, I'm representing the Truman Library. So who do we think might be in this photograph? Well, it's obviously Harry Truman is in this photo. Does anybody like to speculate a guess? And this would be really a guess. Anyone would like to think where Harry Truman might be in this photograph to start us off this afternoon? Any guesses? It's really hard. It's a really hard one to know this. So don't feel bad if you're guessing or don't know, because there's really not very many clues to give that away for you. No guesses. Nobody's going to be brave this afternoon. Front row, says one person. On the right side near the back with white shirts showing. Unfortunately, not correct, Letitia, but that's a good guess. The front row is correct. Anybody want to guess whereabouts on the front row? So we've narrowed it down by the row, and there's really no clues to help you because I don't think he really resembles Truman that we might see today. Ryan gets it first on the left. So on the front row, way over on the left, kind of has, he's got his two hands close together and kind of a white covering around his neck, which we wouldn't necessarily see today. I'm sure there's a technical fashion term for that. So let's look a little closer. What I've done is give you a close-up image of the same person, same photo. So there's we see close-up. So this is Harry Truman in first grade. And anything you might observe about this close-up image, it's a little grainy. You know, it's an old photograph from around 1889. Truman was born in 1884, so he's about 5 years of age. Anything that you think is missing that you might associate with Harry Truman? Anything you think that's missing or not in the photo? Ryan says glasses. Ryan is on it today. Yeah, we don't see his glasses. He's not wearing glasses. However, we speculate at the library, and if you look really closely at his hands, his left and his right hand, and it really is really difficult to see like this in a PowerPoint across the internet. But if you look at the original photograph real close up, what do you think is in his hands? Is he holding anything between his forefinger and his thumb? Possibly. We think he might not. There's somebody behind him holding a hat, and he seems to have maybe a satchel on his waist, a bag. But I think between his fingers, we think he might actually be holding his glasses. I think he might have taken them off for the photograph, which is interesting. I need to ask my daughter. She's got school photos tomorrow. She wears glasses. She's in 5th grade. I wonder if she's going to keep her glasses on for the photo. So that's like the first object we're looking at, just to get us warmed up. It's kind of a neat one. I'm going to go back to show you that first photograph again. And there you see Harry close up, possibly with those glasses in his fingers, that he took them off for the photo. We do think he was wearing glasses at this time based on some other evidence. So that's our first object. Let's move on to a more three-dimensional object, more of an artifact from the museum. What we're going to do when we look at some of these artifacts is we're going to use this type of worksheet from the National Archives. And I'm going to link for you a little bit later on. And you can use these types of questions. Students, if you're tuning in today, you can use these types of questions to analyze objects or artifacts. And teachers, of course, you can use this too. And there's actually one for older students as well. And I got the link on the last slide later today. But you can think about what things are made of, what it's made out of, whether it's plastic or paper or metal or leather and so on, whether you think it's heavy, light, smooth, rough, hard, soft, the color, the shape, the size, 3 words that describe it, and all of these other questions. And then the last one I like is, where can you find more information about the object or the people that used it? So let's look at this first one over on the left side. I've left those questions up on the right side. We may look at some of those. I don't think we'll look at all of them today, but you certainly could in class. So what do we look at? What this first object on the left, this first section of this worksheet says, meet the artifact. So somebody has said it's made of wood and metal. What do you think it is? Or what do you think it's made out of? Answer any of those questions that you feel you could answer, and then we'll see what you come up with. So we have an object on the left. Somebody says right away it's a pitchfork, and those are correct answers, both Haber and David and Ryan. And then Maddox says it's made of wood and metal. So maybe some of the others, what's the size of this, do you think? Or do you think it feels heavy or light? And it's hard, of course, with just a photograph. You pretty much nailed what it's made out of, wood and metal. And then there's also questions on the right. And there's also questions at the bottom about where you might be able to find any more. So what do you think, who do you think would have used this? It looks light and heavy, so kind of contradictory, right? And maybe it is light, maybe it is heavy. It's hard to tell just from this object. Or the size looks fairly reasonable size to me. Or any words that describe it. What are 3 words that describe the object? Take a stab at any of those questions. And of course, you can use this to analyze any object in the future. And we'll use some of these questions again here this afternoon. probably about 4 feet in length, possibly, and awkward to hold. Sharp and smooth, says Maddox. Very good. Anything else you want to observe about this particular object? As you begin to run out of things, this last question is always one that I like. How could you find out more about it? How do you think you would find out more information about this pitchfork, do you think? Or answer any of the other questions? What is a pitchfork used for example? It's a tool. What is it used for? And how might it relate to Harry Truman? Because of course, all of the things we're going to see today relate to Harry Truman. So somebody wrote turning sod or cleaning a stable, lifting hay, and he's a farmer. Very good, Marcus. It would be for lifting hay, and he was a farmer. Harry Truman was a farmer for about 11 years. So we saw his grade school picture earlier. After he graduates from high school, this is where we learn a little bit about the Truman life story. He works in banks and a few other businesses in downtown Kansas City. And then in 1906, about 5 years after he graduates high school, so in his early 20s, he is asked to work on the family farm in Grandview, Missouri. And that's where this object came from. Let's see what we can find out about it. A couple of you said lifting hay. And that next question at the very bottom, how do you think you could find out more? Well, in our archives at the Truman Library, we have some other information that can supplement this. So this is a letter that Harry Truman wrote in that time period that he is working on the farm. So this is in 1912. Harry Truman works on the farm from about 1906 to about 1917. So as I said, about 11 years. So in that middle of that time period, he writes this letter. And of course, it's all in cursive. And this is just one page of the letter. But I've highlighted this section on the right. And of course, it's very in cursive and it can be difficult to read. So I've typed it underneath for you. I'm going to push a pitchfork in the morning. We have about 60 acres of hay cut. So he's writing to his girlfriend, Bess Wallace. They're not married yet. They don't get married until 1919. And this is paper. And it's a letter he's written to her. And in the Truman Library archives, we have approximately 1,300 letters Harry Truman wrote to Bess. And that's often how we can find out more information about Harry Truman's life. And during the time that he was a farmer, he was writing to Bess Truman a lot from about 1910 until about 1917 when he goes off to France. He writes to her a lot about what he's doing and his everyday activities, and he's working on the farm throughout that time period. Of course, at the Truman Library, we have other documents and materials and photographs. So here we have a photograph of Harry Truman from around the same time period, around 1910. And here he's working on the farm. This is Harry Truman on the back of what we call a cultivator. And then, of course, you see the animals pulling the cultivator along as he's plowing a furrow in the field. So often you can add photographs and letters to objects to find out more about them. So let's move on. After being a farmer until 1917, some large world events take over and we get to see our next object. So I'll stop for a moment and let me know similar questions on terms of an object. What do you think this is? What do you think it might be made of? You can also combine with visual thinking. What do you notice? What do you notice here in this object? I'm really trying not to say anything about it. It's hard not to give clues for teachers who are tuning in. Sometimes it's really hard to hold back and not tell the students exactly what's in front of them. Let them try and deduce and infer for themselves. So Nicole says he joined the military in World War I. Ryan says a World War I ID card. You guys are amazing. So anything else you notice that? A military ID card, says Maddox. Very good. You notice any different languages on there? Or any other information about Harry Truman that we may not have talked about? Ingrid says he's in the 35th Division. Very good. There's a big stamp there, purple stamp that says 35th Division. Nicole says he's a captain. And Ingrid says Francais. Yes, it is French rather than Italian. So there's some French there. Corps my French is terrible, but the American Expeditionary Corps is at the top there, and then identity card. No worries, Maddox. It was a good try because it could well have been Italian. Anything else you notice about Harry Truman? Again, what is missing? What is missing from what we might expect when you see photographs of Harry Truman? Similar to that grade school photo. Yeah, he doesn't have his glasses on. And usually with an identification card, usually they ask them to take their glasses off for identification purposes. So you can see that he's the 35th Division. You've got this card that identifies him. His name is Captain. It's got some letters and numbers there we haven't talked about. After it says Captain, it says 129FA. That's a tricky one. Anyone take any guesses? I know we've got some ringers in the audience. Maybe they can help us with this one. 129FA. So that might be more for an adult to respond to. I know there's some people associated with some Truman sites tuning in today. 129th Division, almost division. 129th is right. He's in the 35th Division, not the number of the captain, Nicole, although I might see where you would say that. So any guesses on the FA? Not France, Marcus. Good try. You guys are really trying, and I appreciate that. So it's a tricky one. It is field artillery. So Truman was captain, and he was in charge of firing the guns and the cannons towards the German forces when he was in France. So the field artillery. So they would pull the cannons by horses, set them up, do the measurements. Harry Truman had to do a lot of math and trigonometry and decide where to fire the guns based on the position of the enemy and the wind and the weather. And so it was the field artillery, the 129th Field Artillery in the 35th Division. And in fact, he was captain of Battery D, although it doesn't tell us that on this particular card. And you can see his signature on the bottom. So we got a lot of information all out of one identification card. And you guys did a wonderful job there. And so let's move on to the next one. He's in France in the forces from 1917 until he comes home in 1919. He actually goes to France in 1918, is involved in some of the larger offensives right at the end of the war in August and September and October and November of 1918, and then the war ends. But he doesn't actually come home until the spring of 1919. When he does so, I'll let this one ponder on the screen for a minute. This is one of my favorites. In 1919, he gets married to Bess Wallace, who we saw the letter that he wrote to. They'd been in high school together and graduated high school in 1901. They didn't really start dating until about 1910. And then he goes off to France in 1917. But when he returns home in June of 1919, June 28th, they get married. So why would I show you this object? First of all, it's fairly obvious what it is, but go ahead and type it in there. And then why might I be showing this to you? So speculate about what its use. It is a bike. Yeah. Nicole, you can just go ahead and type in. It's a tricycle, says Ryan. So thank you for raising your hand, but you can go ahead and just type in any questions or comments. To say they had a kid or something, says Marcus, and Nicole, for his kids. Both of you got it. Now they just had one child, Margaret Truman, Mary Margaret Truman. Yeah, somebody notices there's no pedals, okay? And it's actually got the 3 wheels. They just had the one daughter, Margaret. Anything else? What's that made of? And how does that compare to bicycles or tricycles today, do you think? Any speculation? Somebody says metal. Certainly doesn't look very comfortable. Maybe there was a more comfortable seat on there and maybe some more comfortable on the handlebars. No plastic, right? No cushion on the seat. It's made of steel instead of aluminum. Good job, Marcus. Some great observations. Now, again, we asked earlier, how can we know more? So I've got a wonderful image to show you. I'm going to leave this on the screen for a bit longer. The tires don't have I'm not even sure there's necessarily tires on there, but I'd have to look closely from my vantage point. Okay, let's take a look at this next photo. You guys are enjoying this image. This is one of my favorite artifacts, and it's one we're actually going to have on display when the Truman Library and Museum reopens after its museum renovation that's taking place at the moment. Now, take a look at this photograph. So you can see maybe on the handles, there looks like just underneath her right hand, there may be a covering on the handle. We can't see the seats. And yeah, there's pedals on there, right? So the pedals probably have broken off over time. So Margaret Truman, this is who is in this photograph, is Margaret Truman, their one and only daughter. She was born in 1924, about 5 years after their wedding, born in February, and their wedding was in June of 1919. She's born in February of 1924. And this photograph is taken in front of their house in Independence. And you can tell, right? It's the same. Look at the back of the frame. Obviously, it's black and white, so we don't see the red. But there you see the photograph from 2020. And then we see the photograph there. So there are some differences. It has the pedals. We can't see the seat because she's got a longer coat on. Maddox says it looks taller than tricycles today. Sure does. It looks quite tall. So I think that's neat, the way we can match up the artifact in the museum, the object in the museum, and then you can compare that with a historic photo. And this is probably from the late 20s. She's born in 1924. She's probably 3, 4, 5 years of age there, 1927, 1928, somewhere in there, where they take this photo. Looks like it might be a cool day. She's got a jacket on all the way down to her knees and a hat on as well. Okay. Not much difference in terms of the wheels and the tires and things, but maybe a handle on the handlebar, and certainly the pedals is the biggest difference. So you guys did a great job there. So yes, we can learn about his family. He has the one daughter, and her name is Mary Margaret, and this is her on her tricycle, which is exciting. Okay, so now we're fast forwarding a little to the last one of this section, and we see this photograph, and let's speculate. What do we think is happening here? And I've actually got a close-up photo, but let's look at this one first of all. What do we think is happening in this photograph? Ryan says an oath. Yeah, looks like Harry Truman is on the left there, swearing him in for something, says Maddox. Yeah, because he's got his hand on something. What do we think he has his hand on? Harry's being sworn into office. Very good. Yeah, the Bible, he's put his hand, he looks like he's got his hand on a Bible. You guys are doing a great job with your responses. And then, how would you describe the mood of the people around the room? Sad for the most part, right? It seems, if you look at the lady over on the left with the black hat, she seems to have her head down. The lady in the center looks very solemn. You guys are using great words, sad, somber, solemn. I'm not sure I see a smile on any of those people, right? So do we know why? Why are they sad, do you think? So this is where we learn a little bit more. Ryan is on it today. FDR had died, and Marcus says the morning Franklin Roosevelt. Right, so this is April 12th, 1945. And earlier that day, Franklin Roosevelt has passed away. He's the current president at the time. And Vice President Truman, as he was up until this moment, is being sworn in as president. And that's why they're so sad. And this is his wife, Bess Wallace Truman, in the center of the photograph. You can't quite see Margaret, but she's in this photograph too, but she's obscured by this gentleman on the right. And then you see a close-up. This is the same photo, but I've done a close-up for you so you can see the Bible a little bit closer. And the Bible is in our museum collection and will be displayed when we reopen. But you can see the somber faces and a close-up of some of the people and even the clock in the background. We can see it's around almost 7:10 in the evening on the clock. So another one to look at. So now the remaining objects that we're going to look at relate more to Truman as president as we go through his timeline here. And of course, we could have included so many more photographs and objects as we go forward here. So the second part will look from that period that he's president from 1945 through to 1953 is what we're going to look at next. And you have a sneak preview of what those objects are going to be on this timeline. And it's almost like a halftime break for us. Now we get to his presidency. And of course, one of the objects, one of the events that he's most well known for as president is the decision to drop the atomic bomb. So that's the clue for you. It'd be very difficult to determine what this object actually is, and I'll explain it in a moment. But it's interesting because not only is there an object, but there's also a tag that comes alongside of it. So I'm going to show you both of those things. I'm going to show you the tag, and then we may go back. So this is written on the tag, 10th of August, 1945. Maddox says, is it the nuclear code key? Not quite, but it's very, very close to that, Maddox. So it says Tinian Island, 10th of August, 1945. I certify that this is one of the 2 green safety plugs used on F-33 at Nagasaki, Japan on 9th of August, 1945. This was the second atomic bomb dropped on the Empire. And then there's 2 names underneath. F. Ashworth, it's Frederick, and it's Philip Barnes. It's not a uranium container, Marcus, although I appreciate the guess. So we've learned some information there about it. Let's go back and look at it. This tiny little plug with the green end on it, this was inserted in the bomb that was to be dropped on Nagasaki, on the atomic bomb. And what they would do is they would take out what this is called a safety plug, like you would have a safety on any kind of mechanism. You would take the safety plug out and you would put in the live plug to activate the bomb, and then they would drop the bomb at that point. So this is on the plane flying over Nagasaki, they would take out the safety and put in the live plug. Somebody says, is the green wood? It sure looks like it. The bottom end of it looks like metal, but it looks like the top end may well have been wood. It says it activated the bomb. Well, the red plug that they put in its place would activate the bomb. And of course, we don't have that because that's dropped with the bomb itself. But this is what's taken out to stop it actually activating while it's in the plane. So that's why it's called a safety plug. So to stop it activating while on the plane. And then when they're ready to drop the bomb, they would take this plug out and put in the activation, the red plug. Hope that makes sense. Let's look at the tag again. Interesting story about this is that Frederick Ashworth and Philip Barnes were the 2 people responsible for this. And one of them actually came to the Truman Library in the 1990s and donated it to our museum curator, who still works at the library, in the late 1990s. Ryan asked, do we have the plug from Hiroshima? We do not. So that what you would depend upon would be on the engineers on the plane to think about keeping those. And in this case, Mr. Ashworth and Mr. Barnes did think about keeping it and then ultimately donating it to the Truman Library. Now, this is going to be on display in the Truman Library and Museum when we reopen, but alongside of it is going to be this object. This one's a little trickier, maybe. Anybody have any ideas about what this object is? And again, you can kind of use those similar questions. Marcus says a paper crane, and he shouts it. Origami bird, paper crane. You guys are on fire today. It is a paper crane. And It is an origami bird, all of those things. All right, Marcus, you're very welcome to yell paper crane because you have the right answer and it just shows your enthusiasm. So I appreciate your answer. And this was, some of you may be familiar with the paper crane story about Sadako and the paper cranes. Is a children's book that I would recommend to you, Sadako and the 1,000 paper cranes. She survived the bombing of Hiroshima in Japan, and as a symbol of hope and peace, she started to fold paper cranes in hopeful that she would recover from radiation sickness and cancer. Unfortunately, she passed away not long after that, but in the meantime, she folded approximately 1,300 cranes. And just recently, in the last decade, her brother donated one of her last cranes to President Truman's grandson, who still lives in Chicago, Clifton Truman Daniel. And so the Sadako family donated one of these tiny cranes. It is very small. The photograph is a little deceptive. It's a lot tinier than it looks. And he donated that to the Truman family, to Clifton Truman Daniel, and then he donated it to the Truman Library. And it's going to be on display in close proximity to that safety plug that I showed you to really reflect the different reactions and events of the decision to drop the atomic bomb, both for the United States and for the Japanese. So a very meaningful artifact. And we're going to actually have it displayed alongside 600 paper cranes that Kansas City area students have folded during 2020 over the last 6 months or so. It's going to be displayed alongside all of those. It looks like cellophane paper, says Ingrid. It is cellophane paper. That's correct. All of the ones folded by the local students are them on acid-free origami paper. Sadako used any paper she could get a hold of. I think she ran out of origami paper and would use anything she could to continue to fold right up to the end of her life. So a very meaningful artifact, and we're very grateful for the Sadako family for donating it to Clifton Truman Daniel, and then he giving it to the library. So you can find on YouTube how to make your own paper cranes, which is a great project. And you can read the children's story. Sadako and the 1,000 paper cranes would make a wonderful activity to learn about what happened with the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. Moving on. Now we're going to look at a painting. We haven't looked at paintings yet. Let's use more of our visual thinking on this one. What do you notice in this painting? What things do you notice in here? And what might you notice first? And anything that you notice in this painting, go ahead and type in there. And Ingrid says it was painted by Norman Rockwell. Yeah, very good. It's got Norman Rockwell's name on it. Harry Truman is actually not in the photograph, although he's on the newspapers. But angry people, says Ryan. Parents arguing about politics, says Nicole. You guys are doing a great job. A political disagreement, says Ingrid. These are wonderful. You guys are really getting into it. Dewey is in one of the newspapers. So in case you weren't sure about that, well done, Ryan. Dewey is in the newspaper on the left, and Harry Truman is in the newspaper on the right. What else do you notice? What else do you notice in this painting? The dog and the baby look sad and scared. Very good. And there's a cat on the back of the yellow chair there on the right. Well done, Ingrid. There's another animal at the top of the painting as well. Anybody notice that one? It's a little harder to see. You may have to move your videos around. A canary, says Ingrid. And there is a cat on the right. And there's a canary at the top in the cage. So what do you think this, Norman Rockwell is the artist, as you mentioned. What else do you think, what do you think the message of this painting is, do you think? What are they? You said it was a political argument. What else can we infer from this? Vote for Truman. Well, certainly They're arguing about who to vote for, says Ryan. So who's voting, who's wanting each candidate? Which one for which? A house divided, says Maddox. Very good. So you can really analyze this painting down to the details. So who's arguing for which candidate? The husband is for Dewey and the wife is for Harry. Very good. The mom is for Truman. Yep, so you guys got that right. Very good. Ingrid and Ryan and Haver and David and Maddox. Yep, so you can see the newspaper they're holding is who they're supporting. How are they dressed? How are the mom and dad dressed in this painting? Does that tell us anything? Nicely, yeah, fancy. Ryan says dad's in work clothes and mom's staying home. So we see a little bit about the gender roles, right? Dad's going to work. Anybody remember? I don't usually like to ask questions about years, but does anybody know what year this election took place? Approximately. We're right at an election year right now. Not 1944, Marcus, you're real close. Maddox got it, 1948. 1948, and yet the inauguration would be 1949. The election was in 1948. So they're maybe showing a little bit of the gender roles is a little different in 1948, where mom's staying home and dad's going to work. What about the time of day? What time of day is this painting? In the morning, yeah. And so my follow-up question usually would be, what makes you say that? And somebody says breakfast, right? You've got the toaster, you got the sunlight coming in through the window, things like that. So you can really speculate lots of things. I don't have the slide today, but I've done an activity in the past where you can do speech and thought bubbles for the characters, including the dog and the baby and the teddy bear and the cat and the canary. Put speech bubbles or emotion bubbles. You could do emoticons about all of the different thoughts or the conversation to add to it. What are they all saying? What are they all thinking? So you can really take this a long way in terms of the painting. But you've learned a lot just from a few minutes looking at that one painting. The little boy gets no attention. Thank you, Donna. I was waiting for that. He's really in tears. And when people look at the original painting, which we have in our museum, often people really notice that boy. He's kind of at the forefront at the bottom of the painting. And I think you can see it even on this slide. He's got big tears rolling down his cheeks. And I think his only friend is that teddy bear. So well noticed about the little boy not getting attention. So, and then you can talk about the emotions of the man and the emotions of the woman and so on and so on. So you can really take that quite further, but it really shows you in 1948 how divided the country was. And I think that's more Norman Rockwell's point. The print of this was actually on the cover of a magazine at that time, right around the time of the election. And it really showed how the country was divided in an election year. And here we are a week away from a presidential election ourselves. So I wonder what a painting would look like today for the 2020 election. And I'm sure there are some divided houses in similar fashion. Okay, so now we're moving on. That was in 1948. Now we're moving to the Korean War and around 1950. And I'm just moving my chat box. So there's two items here and they kind of go hand in hand. We have an object on the left, and then we have a letter that came with this object that was sent to President Truman. I'm going to read it just in case you can't read the text on the screen. It's fairly clear, but it says, Mr. Truman, as you have been directly responsible for the loss of our son's life in Korea, you might as well keep this emblem on display in your trophy room as a memory of one of your historic deeds. Our major regret at this time is that your daughter was not there to receive the same treatment as our son received in Korea. Signed, William Banning. And so Marcus mentions that that's a purple heart on the left, and then this letter that came with it. Very powerful. what is William Banning saying to President Truman about the Korean War and about his son? They did do a misspelling. It says singed instead of signed. Well spotted, Ingrid. And of course, we would not change the historic document. So we have got it there scanned as it was. Nicole is correct, says it was Truman's fault. What was Truman's fault? What was Mr. Banning? That he holds Truman responsible for his son's death. Very good, Nicole, and very good, Therese. Yeah, so he's holding, and this is where we talk about the president's responsibility. He's very bitter, says Ingrid, and you can really attach some emotions to this. Very good, Nicole. And so President Truman actually kept this Purple Heart and this letter in his desk drawer. So it was obviously very meaningful to him, even though it's very critical of his decision to send troops to Korea in the Korean War in 1950. President Truman holds on to this letter. Of course, we remember that Truman was a war veteran himself, as we learned earlier with that identification card, that he was a war veteran of the First World War. So he's obviously has strong feelings himself about William Banning's letter. We have no record of any reply or any response, but we do know that President Truman kept this in his desk even after he died. Even in his desk at the Truman Library, he kept this Purple Heart and letter with him until the end of his life in 1972. So a very powerful letter, and something that was obviously very meaningful to President Truman. And I just wanted to show you this because it not only does it have a lot of power, but it shows you about the significance of the responsibility a president has for all of their decisions. Those decisions they make obviously affect everyday people. And this is one example of a letter where somebody obviously was very angry and bitter and sad about the loss of their son, quite rightly. And then he tells President Truman he wishes that his daughter, Margaret, would receive the same treatment. So there's a human cost to his decisions. Absolutely. Well done, Maddox. Moving on. So while Truman is president, well, I'm trying not to give the answer away here. Let me see if you can figure out what this unusual item is. This is already hanging in the Truman Library Museum. What do we think is hanging from the ceiling here? What do we think is hanging from the ceiling? A real tough one, this object. But let's see if any of you can guess what is hanging from the ceiling. Somebody says a ceiling fan, not quite a ceiling fan, a wooden beam, a model of a plane. So the second answer there, a wooden beam, not part of a bridge, not really foundation, not wood from his home, not a ship beam either. So the wood part is right. So starting with the wood is correct, not from his childhood home, part of a roof or a ceiling. Possibly, what building do you think it might be from? What building do you think this wooden beam might be from? If it's not his childhood home. The White House, says Ryan. The White House is correct. So during Truman's presidency, particularly in the second term, they noticed that the White House was in very poor condition, and they renovated the White House, and the Trumans actually moved out for about 2.5 years across the street around 1950. And they tore out a lot of the old wooden beams like this one. And you can even see cracks in it on the left there, and on the right, you can see cracks in these beams. His daughter Margaret's piano leg came through the ceiling one day in the White House that really showed them what poor condition the White House was in. And so they tore out all of the wooden beams and they put in a more steel structure. And Maddox, you're absolutely right. They lived in the Blair house across the street. And there's a whole other episode there. There's actually an assassination attempt on President Truman while he's living in the Blair house. But they tore out all of these wooden beams, and these wooden beams are original from the White House that the Truman Library now has on display at the museum. So that's a fascinating object. And that story of Margaret Truman's piano is one that we like to tell. And there's a whole exhibit there about the renovation of the White House. And actually, I would encourage you to look at the White House Historical Association's website. They have lots of wonderful materials about the White House renovation. President Truman did hear the gunfire from his room, and unfortunately, one of the guards did die as a result of the attempt. And then the last item for our presentation today, probably the one that most people are familiar with, is this last item. What is this item? Simplest question for today. What is this item? It's the buck stops here sign. So this is the sign that President Truman had on his desk, kind of had his motto, the buck stops here. And the way to think about this, the way to think about what this means, not really a re-election motto, but just his motto, Ingrid. That's a good question. Yeah, he makes the final decision. So if you take the word buck and you replace the word buck with the word responsibility, the phrase says the responsibility stops here. And that's what Truman put on his desk. And he decided as president, his philosophy would be that all of the responsibility, all of the decision-making stops at his desk. So if there are failures, he will take responsibility and not blame anybody else. The buck stops with him. The responsibility stops with him. Okay, I do not have a photograph with me today of the other side of this sign, but does anybody know what the back side of this sign says? So did buck mean responsibility in those times? More or less, Ingrid, more or less, yeah. So it just meant that the decision-making, the responsibility stopped with him. The actual meaning of the phrase comes from a card game where you pass a knife handle around that has a buck handle on it. And then when you're playing cards, if the knife stopped with you, it meant the buck stops here. Anybody have any guesses of what the back side of the sign might be? And really, you've got to visit the library to see that. Something to do with his home state. And it would be the side of the sign that would face him. Nobody wants to take a guess? It's fairly straightforward. It says on the other side, I am from Missouri. I am from Missouri. And the reason he had that facing him is that was kind of a reminder. Being president, he didn't want to get too big for his boots, as they say. He didn't want to get too big-headed. He always wanted to remind himself where he came from, that he came from Missouri, and to remind himself of that. So just to wrap up, some resources that you can use. The Truman Library website where I work, trumanlibrary.gov/education. We have lots and lots of resources there for distance learning, for virtual learning, digital archives. We have more than 50,000 photographs online, more than 50,000 primary source documents online. So you can find lots of materials there and other YouTube presentations that we've done a link there, as well as 400 lesson plans and lots of other materials for students and teachers. We have our analysis sheets that I showed you one at the beginning of the presentation about analyzing objects, but there's also analysis sheets for photographs and cartoons and other formats, posters and so on, and visual thinking strategies that we used a little bit this afternoon as well, that you can look at for ideas and how to use that with visual materials. And then there's my email address. So if you needed to email me directly, you can do that. And now I will stop the show and take any questions. And if we use the chat for the questions, we can do that right now. So any questions, go ahead and type them in, and we'll take those as we wrap up the session. If not, you want to sign up. Thank you very much for attending, and ask any questions that you have about Harry Truman or about any of the objects at all. Do they use a new Bible for every president? Ryan, that is a great question. I know they scrambled around for a Bible for President Truman. I'm assuming they do because often the president would want to keep that and probably end up in the presidential library. Goodbye, Marcus. Thank you. So I'm going to say, I'm not 100% certain, but I think they probably do use a new Bible because it would, like I said, almost be like a souvenir. When did he become a haberdasher? Hava and David, that was in 1919 when he came back from World War I and he got married. The first business that he opened was a haberdashery in downtown Kansas City with his army friend, Eddie Jacobson. So they opened Truman and Jacobson in 1919. Korean War casualties. Do we have documents in the Truman Library related to MacArthur's role in that? Well, we certainly have hundreds, if not thousands, of documents related to the Korean War and Truman's relationship with MacArthur. So on the surface, Christine, yes, we do. Specifically what you're looking for, may I recommend that you contact the Truman Library. If you've got a specific question about particular documents, you can contact truman.library@nara.gov and send an email about that. But if you have something about particular document you're looking for. But yes, we do have lots and lots of material. I'd also suggest you look on our online documents on our website, trumanlibrary.gov. Go into library or research. We have a section of online documents on the Korean War. Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate that feedback. Maddox asked, did he have any regret bombing Japan? All I've seen about that is he regrets that he had to make that decision, but he often blames the Japanese for bombing the Pearl Harbor, for getting the United States involved in the war. So I don't think that he really has expressed any regret. He wishes he didn't have to do it, but he felt like he did not have any choice. Michael asked, is that a painting of the USS Constitution hanging on the wall in the Oval Office? I'm going to have to look that up. I forgot that I put that up in my virtual background. In his Oval Office, he had many forms of transportation. Lots of planes were an interest of his. Of course, a portrait of FDR and portraits of Washington. As for the ships, I'll have to go back and do some research. There's lots of artifacts in that office, and I don't have that right in front of me. So I'm sorry, Michael, I'll have to look that one up. Okay, great questions and great interest today. So any final comments? Thank you, Ryan. I'm glad you thought it was fun. I tried my best. Did he ever want to be president? Well, he was president, but you're right. It's a good question. I don't think he really necessarily wanted to. He kind of turned down the vice presidential nomination at first, and then FDR had to kind of twist his arm and force him into it. So I don't think he really had ambitions to be president. I think he was quite happy being senator, and he did describe the 10 years as senator as the happiest years of his life. He was the senator from Missouri from 1934 to 1944, and he was very happy in that role. So I don't think he necessarily had ambitions to be president, but when the president asked him to be his vice presidential candidate in the convention of 1944, he couldn't turn him down. So that's probably my better answer for that, Maddox. That's a really very thoughtful question. Oh, I missed one. What did Margaret do after her dad died? Well, let's see. She was a writer. She wrote murder mysteries that you can purchase today. She was also a concert singer. He didn't die until 1972. She was born in 1924, so she was a little older in life. Then she was married and had 4 children, so 4 grandsons for Harry Truman. She lived a lot of years of her life in Manhattan, in New York, where she lived right up until the end of her life. She actually passed away in Chicago in 2008, living with her oldest son, Clifton. But at that time, there was last year or so of her life in Chicago, but up until then in Manhattan. And incidentally, not only are President Truman and Mrs. Truman buried in the courtyard at the Truman Library, but Margaret Truman's ashes are also buried in the courtyard of the Truman Library as well, along with her husband. So you can see all 4 of their markers at the Truman Library in our courtyard when you come to visit. So I think we're right on the end of our time. But if you have any other questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes. But thank you for your participation and great feedback.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark, for your time. And thank you for everybody who joined. Hopefully we'll see you at some of our future programs as well. All right. Have a good afternoon.